Good afternoon. This is Rob Murphy. I'm the John P. Phair Professor of Infectious Diseases in the Department of Medicine. I'm also professor in Biomedical Engineering and Executive Director of the Institute for Global Health. Going to be giving an update on coronavirus 19 today. What I'm going to do over the next 45 minutes or so is to give a little overview of the basic virology, the epidemiology, and local responses, some interventions that are ongoing and may be tried, and the overall impact of the healthcare system on the healthcare system and clinical research. Then talk about some technical innovation and how to design the optimal global health response to COVID. Human coronaviruses have been around for a long time. There are many of them. There are 7 that can infect and cause disease in humans. On this slide here, the first 4 that you see up there are typically cause about 15–20% of common colds. Oftentimes after these infections, antibody will appear, but usually the infection is not all that severe, and typically the antibody response does not last very long. That changed a little bit with SARS. So that stands for Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome, which I'm sure you've heard about. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. And then followed by MERS, the Mideast Respiratory Syndrome. So those epidemics have come and gone. Then of course we have SARS-CoV-2, which is actually the name of the virus, and the disease it's causing is coronavirus 19, or for short, COVID-19. So coronaviruses got serious with the SARS epidemic. It was mostly nosocomial infections in hospitals. There were some healthcare workers. It impacted maybe about 8,000 people or so, with about 10% mortality rate. But this disease has actually gone away. However, that sparked more interest in coronaviruses and led to some scientific innovation, including medications and vaccines. But because it went away, it kind of, people lost interest in it, and it was basically on the way out the door. Then, of course, in 2012, MERS came about. Very much limited to the Mideast, except for one outbreak in South Korea, where somebody had traveled from the Mideast to South Korea. So there were 3 little mini outbreaks. It hasn't completely gone away, but it doesn't affect very many people. However, the people that it does infect kills about 30%. So we've got these other epidemics with the coronaviruses, higher mortality rates, but not as many people. And now we have coronavirus. So of course, these numbers on here are not accurate. I'll give you the update now. So there's been a lot of deadly viruses, and there's been a lot of epidemics that are as big as this. So, of course, Ebola, I'm sure everyone's heard of that, but Hanta, Lassa, rabies, smallpox, dengue, and influenza, also an epidemic stature. And the epidemics you see on the right here, of course, there was HIV epidemic, the Hong Kong flu in '68, the Asian flu in '56, '57. The big flu in 1918, which was really a catastrophe with up to 50 million deaths. More flus in Russia. It goes all the way back to the Justinian age and the Antonine age. The Antonine one killed 5 million people, about 20–25% of the entire Roman Empire. It may have actually contributed to its downfall. They never actually figured out what caused that one. So they're nothing new. So for COVID-19, the clinical characteristics are here. So almost everybody that has clinical disease anyway has fever, 99%. But also fatigue, dry cough, anorexia, myalgias, shortness of breath, sputum production, and unusual rashes, oftentimes just on the feet, and an unusual side effect, and that being loss of smell and taste, which occurs in up to 30%, probably even more, because it's not typically a question we actually ask people, and a lot of people don't realize that it's associated with the disease, which it is, but it's very unique for coronavirus infection. So here's the numbers as of today the global reported caseload is 3.5 million, with 247,000 deaths. The Americans are way ahead of everybody else in the world with this disease, with 1.156 million cases in the United States and 67,000 deaths. Followed by what you see there: Spain, Italy, the UK, France, Germany, China, Mexico, and South Korea. So there's more in between there, but these are the ones I wanted to highlight. I think the one I want you to keep in mind, there's a couple. One is the Germans. Something unusual is happening there in that their death rate is very low. And then in South Korea, which was one of the early hard-hit countries, has really had very little increase, and they've been able to keep the whole epidemic stable and only 250 deaths. So those are the two big outliers here. The Chinese numbers you see there, they haven't really changed much over the last month or so. We're not really sure what's going on with those numbers and how much of those numbers to believe, but the hospitals have emptied out, and those big, huge, massive hospitals they built have been dismantled. So here's the number of cases and the deaths worldwide. You can see the number, the chart here, really going up, continues to this day. This is data as of up to yesterday. And the confirmed cases per million is continuing to increase that you see there on the red. These are the number of confirmed deaths due to COVID-19 worldwide and in the United States. You see there is some little trend maybe in the death rates going down. Here's the case fatality rate by country. We actually don't know what the case fatality rate is because we don't know really what the denominator is. So you can see here, there's, however you measure it, there's a considerable difference between the countries. So the United States there is in yellow in the middle. These are just with the confirmed death rate against the confirmed infection rate. So we expect in the United States that probably there's somewhere between 5 and 10 times as many cases as there are confirmed. And that's because of the testing shortage that is just now sort of being alleviated. But other countries have fared much worse. The Italians, the Spanish, the world rate is higher. And then, as I mentioned, the German rate is low, South Korea and Iceland also very low rate. So here's the national statistics as of today. So New York leads the way with 313,000, followed by New Jersey and Massachusetts. Illinois comes in fourth. We're the 6th largest state by population. We have a lot fewer people living here than in California or Texas, but they have much lower numbers of cases. But the other sort of key ones that I follow are Florida, Texas, and Louisiana. Because these are the states that didn't really follow the shelter-in-place rules and open things up very quickly. So it's going to be interesting to see actually what happens in those states. One of the ways that we are looking at this is to see how many tests are being done per confirmed case. So how we got to this state is that it turns out that there are a lot of people with no symptoms. When this thing first started, the Chinese had reported it was less than 1%. We didn't really believe there was that much. But in studies done recently, particularly one at Columbia University in their maternity ward and 217 pregnant women coming in, the 4 that had a fever all had coronavirus. But unfortunately, 15% of the asymptomatics also had coronavirus. Some of them ultimately developed symptoms, but some of them did not. These patients turn out to be highly infectious. They have high viral loads, and this is of a huge concern, particularly as it relates to going back to work. So that means that we have to shift from just focusing on those presenting with symptoms to those that are asymptomatic. So if we're going to open up a school, a laboratory, a non-essential business, a sports arena, a theater, we have to be testing an awful lot of asymptomatic people. So you can see here, this is the number of tests per confirmed case. So the United States is way down on this list. In other words, we're not testing that many people. Our test rate in Illinois of the number of tests done went from 20 to 25% down to 15% because they ramped up testing massively over the last week and tested actually on Sunday 19,000 cases. That was a huge jump. So here's the number of cases. This is the molecular test for diagnosis per 1,000 persons. So you can see where everybody is there. The United States is now kind of in the middle of the pack. And the Mexicans are actually one of the worst. It's like 0.4 per 1,000 being tested. But it ranges. And here's the Chicago statistics. This is actually the big increase in the new cases in the last 24 hours with over 3,000 cases actually. But despite that, and that is primarily due to the increase in the testing, is you look at the shape of that curve and that the doubling has increased now out to every 15 days. So that's a good sign. The other things that are a good sign here is that the hospital never got really overwhelmed. We had, I think at the highest, our census was like 250. We have like over 900 beds. The ICU stayed functional. We didn't really run out of beds. McCormick Place, as you know, was requisitioned as an emergency hospital. They only admitted, I think, 3 dozen patients, and the thing is being dismantled as we speak. So we were fortunate to keep control over the infection here in Chicago. So here's a little bit about outcomes. This has been updated, but the numbers are remaining about the same. So this is published in the MMWR in March, but you can see that the fatality rate is really very much age related. And in those over 85, it's up to 30% almost, 65 to 84, 3 to 11%, 55 to 64, 1 to 3%, and then less than 1% for ages less than that, and very few deaths below 20, although there are a few. This is data from the Centers for Disease Control that gather the hospitalization rate by age and by ICU admissions. And you can see that the issue with hospitalizations is not so much related to age. There are plenty of young people getting hospitalized, getting very sick, and a lot of them even going to the ICU. With the exception that people under 20, very few of them are admitted to the hospital, but there are a few. But you can see here, each age bracket is pretty much represented in the number of people going to the hospital and the number of people going into the intensive care unit. The difference really is in the mortality, and that the older people and people with underlying comorbidities, of course, do worse. But a lot of people are getting intubated in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, 50s. However, if they're in otherwise good health, they tend to be discharged. Our intensive care unit mortality rate is actually pretty low. It's only about 12%. So we're very, very fortunate, and we have a really highly skilled team taking care of all these people. That's not true in many other places. So if you look at the overall outcomes, this is data from all over the United States, just to reiterate the impact of age. So adults over 65 and over account for 31% of all the cases, 53% of all the ICU admissions, and 80% of all the deaths. Hence the importance of the older age group and how much more at risk they are to having a serious outcome from this disease. And so if you look at ICU admits, hospitalization, and deaths, just graphically, you can see on this figure here. And what this actually means is that if you just look at the death rate, you're not looking at the stress rate on the on the hospital system because these people are coming in the hospital, they're taking up beds. Now, one of the reasons why we didn't run out of beds is that all the elective surgery pretty much was put off, and patients are still afraid to come to the hospital. So we thought it was originally going to be, this is just going to be on top of our hospital capacity, but that actually is absolutely not the case. Now, people are going to have to come in the hospital if they have an emergency, or they're ultimately going to have these elective surgeries. And that's all ramping back up as we speak, as our numbers start to go down. So this is the first cut in the data from Northwestern. These are 1,873 patients who've been diagnosed with SARS-CoV-2. And you can see the median age is 53. It's 26% over 65. Pretty much equal men and women. And women seem to have a milder course with this disease. We had 23% Black, 24% Hispanics, smokers, Cook County, Chicago split. You can see it there. So they had a lot of comorbidities, and the significant ones are bolded here. So we had a lot of people with cardiovascular disease. This was statistically significant compared to patients without COVID, diabetes and hypertension, and having more than one of any of those was actually over half the patients, or almost half the patients. So that's all the patients diagnosed. How about those that landed up in the hospital? Well, you can see these numbers really reflect exactly what is happening with the national statistics, and this is the risk on the right. So if you assume under 40 as the risk of 1, and as soon as you get over 40, it's 2 times more. Over 60, it's 4 times more. And it just keeps going up with age. Doesn't seem to be much of a difference over 70. So 70 is really kind of our big cutoff here. So if you look at who actually gets hospitals, like I mentioned earlier, men are doing worse with this disease. People who smoked, this is causing a lung disease, so smokers do worse. And those that have multiple comorbidities, they do worse. What we have not seen here, and what you've probably seen reported, is that Blacks and to a lesser extent Hispanics are having much more mortality. We did not see that in our population. So we're actually in the process now of drilling down on those numbers and actually seeing where those Black people are from. Are they from the census tracts and zip codes where there is more poverty or not? We don't know. So that's being looked at. We're not sure. So here's and this is the data set was cut off on the 21st of April, our hospitalization rate, but you can see it was already starting to go down then. It's pretty equal now. We're discharging people. We're still admitting people, but it's kind of ramping down a little bit. Here's our hospitalized patients. This is just the group coming in the hospital, 40% over 65. The men, as I mentioned, and the other factors were not significant. Comorbidities of the hospitalized patients, it's the same here. Only 31% of the patients had a known exposure to COVID. So this is very disturbing. That really means 69% of the people pick this up in the community somehow. So this is our big problem. Some of the tests that we do that increase the suspicion for COVID-19 are inflammatory proteins such as CRP and D-dimer, which are typically significantly elevated in this population. So, what kind of interventions can we do? Well, we can do nothing. It might seem silly, but there's a lot of people that really are promoting that we do nothing, that we just let everybody get infected and just wait for native immunity to come in while we're waiting for a vaccine or some new treatment. I'll talk about the treatments in a minute. That is an approach that a lot of people, anybody in public health, does not agree with, and any sane medical person. And so the approaches that have been taken, as you're all aware, of course, we close the university here. We close, all the schools are closed, isolate cases, and we do household quarantines and isolation, home quarantines, and the social distancing that's there. And if all that stuff doesn't work, there's other things that can be done. The government actually can induce a mandatory quarantine. The government can actually take over everything and tell everybody what they can do and they can't do. And actually, you can actually have martial law put into place. So we have been gotten that extreme. But keep in mind, we don't know how the percentage of people dying from this, whether it's 4%, 2%, 1%, 0.6% like the flu, or 0.1% like some people are claiming because there's all these asymptomatic people. We don't know what it is. But one thing for sure, it is stressing out the system. And any intervention that we take has got to be based on science in combination with good leadership. So we hear all about the social distancing, which now in Illinois is extended to the end of this month at a minimum. So social distancing is absolutely nothing new. In the influenza epidemic of 1918, it was basically like, no, cities could social distance or not. It was kind of do what you want. So there were a couple big examples here. This is Philadelphia versus St. Louis. The St. Louis group, they canceled everything. They closed bars. They stopped sports events versus Philadelphia, which kept everything open, said, oh, we'll just get through this. Well, yeah, they got through it, but they killed an awful lot of people in the process. And not only did they kill a lot of people, excess number of people, but the longer-term economic benefit favored the cities that had the longer shelter-in-place rules. So those are the orange color there are the ones that had more shelter in place compared to the gray ones. And so you had a difference in mortality rate, and then you had a difference in higher employment gains after, probably because they didn't disrupt the whole work schema so much in the places that controlled the infection better. Here's what social distancing looks like downtown. This is a shot down LaSalle Street toward the Board of Trade. Pretty empty now in the daytime, nighttime, all times. So one of the tools that we can use is this one from the University of Washington. And it's really nice, it's a fun tool where you can look at transmission and clinical dynamics. You see on the bottom of the slide, there's all different kinds of metrics that you can adjust. So you can put your population, you can put the infection rate, you can put the transmission time, you can put morbidity statistics, all sorts of stuff. And this chart will just move around. Another way to look at that is if you do a prediction for the proportion of people who get infected. So starting in the upper left, this is if 10% of the people get infected, I assume the mortality rate was 0.5%. But you can adjust all of these. It doesn't really make too much difference, but assume it's 0.5%, 10%. That already makes coronavirus as the third most common cause of death in the United States, or fourth, excuse me, at 165,000. That is the number they're kind of talking about now. It's going in that direction. If the infection rate goes up to around 20%, it jumps into number 3, 30%, 40%. When you get to 40%, it jumps into the number 2 position. And if half the people in the country become infected, it will become the leading cause of death in the United States, and so forth. Now, you can play around with that fatality rate if you want, and things will change around, but I think the point is pretty clear. So here's the kind of the stress of the system. So you have ICU beds, you have ICU patients, you have hospital patients. And this whole like flattening the curve thing means you're trying to squish this graph down because many systems implode as the hospitalization and ICU needs increase. Um, Here's just the impact of the social distancing, like in 1918 and now. The model is that if you just do it for 14 days, you end up with 128 million infections, which is not very good. But if you do it for 60 days, which is a little bit on the course that we're on now, the model is some 14 million or so people will become infected. So what is our capacity? So in the United States, we got about 6,000 hospitals, about 1 million beds, 36 million hospital admits, ICU beds, 70, 80,000, number of ventilators, 160. And every year, 2.8 million people die. So what do we need to keep addressing this? Well, the things that have really, are the most important is this testing capacity. Not only is the testing capacity, but everything that goes around with the testing, like swabs. We didn't even have enough swabs to do the tests. All the reagents, everything, the whole supply chains are completely disorganized and disrupted. And then the personal protective equipment is a complete catastrophe here. We still don't have enough. When I go in the hospital, it's not actually very often. I just go in when I have my patients in there. I mean, they give me a mask. I have to put my mask in a paper bag when I leave and reuse it the next time I come. These things are designed to be used once and thrown away. Anyway, it's a little bit insane. The issue with the beds and the hospital and the ICU beds and the ventilators, that actually has been, New York, of course, came very close to having a total collapse. But even they're getting out of it now. The number of cases are going down there. There's more cases now in Long Island. But the city itself seems to be getting under control. The surge personnel, we haven't had the problem here. We had a little bit of an issue with McCormick Place hiring all these people, but then they only had 36 patients. So I guess they're back at their main hospitals. Here's what happens to the bed needs. This is just ICU bed needs, but you could model this for regular beds or whatever, based on the different kind of interventions that I mentioned. So, the black is the do nothing. So, and then you can see the other interventions there, whether you do just case isolation, close schools, all that stuff, or do everything in the blue line there, and it can really bring that need down significantly so we don't have this giant crisis. And that pretty much has happened. So what about this testing capacity? The testing capacity and the PPE and stuff, there are laws on the books, including one in the 50s called the Defense Production Act. But there were also laws on the books even during, in the 40s, during the war, where the United States government actually has the authority to go in and just take over, could take over university laboratories, could take over, it's mostly production facilities. This picture that you see on the left here is Sewell Avery, who was the president of Montgomery Wards. Montgomery Wards was the first Amazon in the United States. They had the catalog and everything. They were before the Sears catalog, by the way. Sewell Avery ran a very good business back then, and he did not want to collaborate with Franklin Roosevelt in World War II because part of the deal was when they were, the U.S. government was trying to buy supplies from Montgomery Wards that it insisted that they use union workers, and he was a big anti-union guy. And so he refused, and so they said, well, go arrest him, and he wouldn't cooperate, and so they just lifted him up out of his chair and hauled him out of the building. So the government can do this. They haven't, although they've insisted that the meat processing plants reopen, the ones that have been closed because over 5,000 people have been killed in them. But anyway, the government has some options. Ideally, we would want to do pre-agreed upon national and international planning regarding all this stuff. And the United States has definitely not done that. Okay, clinical research in COVID-19. So There are at least 114 vaccine trials planned or underway worldwide. There's been a lot of press about the vaccine trials. The NIH is developing vaccines, but everybody, Oxford is developing a vaccine. They swear they're going to be in people by this fall. And that because the disease is it's so rapid that they think that the actual clinical trials will be relatively short, and that we could have a vaccine out as early as first quarter 2021. That's if everything is perfect, that the manufacturers, everyone's like in alignment, and it works, the dose is right, people don't get sick from it, whatever, and this vaccine could be out pretty quickly. Those of you who've worked in vaccine development or any kind of drug development, you realize that that's wishful thinking. Let's hope it works. I know the Gates Foundation has actually announced that they're funding 7 vaccine manufacturing facilities, with the understanding that probably most of them, definitely over half of them, will probably never be used because the vaccine won't work or there'll be something wrong with it or whatever. But anyhow, just to hedge all the bets, they're doing that. There are we can't even count how many drugs are being developed. There's a lot of stuff being used that have been around before. I just have a laundry list of them here. But what we'll see in the second wave of these drugs are the new ones that are actually being developed from scratch. But you know how long that takes. You have the preclinical work in the laboratory, then you have the animal studies, first in man studies. I mean, I saw in the AIDS epidemic, which I was very much involved in, I think the fastest was 3.5 years for a drug to be developed. Maybe with this disease, it's going to be less, but I don't know. It's going to take many years. But those would be the ideal drugs, the ones that are targeted. So remdesivir is the drug that was approved for emergency use on last Friday, by Gilead. It's an intravenous drug. It has a very modest effect so far, but it does have some kind of effect. And then the stuff you see on there are drugs that have been around for a long time, and they're in some countries they're actually approved. Hydroxychloroquine has, of course, gotten the biggest amount of press, primarily because the president was touting it as a cure-all. And pretty much already that whole flame has gone out as the toxicities showed up that everyone should have known about it in the first place, and the fact that in the trials it doesn't even work. Then there's AIDS drugs, progesterone, the IL-6 inhibitors, giving convalescent plasma, ribavirin, the flu drug, intravenous immunoglobulin. So the remdesivir looks like it is effective. 53 patients were treated compassionately with no control group. They generally had positive outcomes. And then the randomized clinical trial, the interim results, which were reported last Thursday, had over 1,000 patients. This was a placebo-controlled trial, and the patients did better. It's pretty modest improvement, not too dissimilar that we see with Tamiflu and the flu. But 4 days actually in a hospitalized patient is actually a lot. So that opens up a lot of beds, and people get out. They don't know about the mortality yet. There was an uncontrolled randomized trial in China, which was stopped due to low enrollment because they've actually, with all the enforced kind of mandatory social distancing, the disease they don't have enough people to do the clinical trial. One of the drugs being developed here is an MTAse inhibitor, and this is through the work of Carla Satchel in microbiology and immunology at Feinberg. And that's an exciting drug, but that's like starting from scratch, going up. It inhibits an identifiable target, and it's in development. The hydroxychloroquine I mentioned, it's really got a very mixed history. 2 randomized clinical trials failed to show anything. Adding azithromycin just caused more toxicity. There's cardiac toxicity. There's definitely been deaths. It's not working. The AIDS drugs also basically no benefit. Steroids, nothing. Progesterone, this is interesting. These trials are going on now. Women have better outcomes regardless of age, even regardless of menopausal status. And pregnant women actually even do better. So it's actually 2 studies going on, one on the East Coast, one on the West Coast. So in the IL-6 inhibitors, these are basically to address the cytokine storm that happens in a lot of people just before they die from this disease. Those studies are ongoing. Convalescent plasma therapy from people who've survived. Some very small trials being studied. Ribavirin, Ostemivir, intravenous immunoglobulin has been used, but no big studies. Now, what can we do? NIBIB launched on the 29th of April it's called Rapid Acceleration of Diagnostics, or RADX. And the goal is to increase diagnostic molecular testing by 20-fold. And they've been given $500 million from the Congress as of the passing of the bill a week ago. And so that is going through NIBIB. Then, of course, so that's one thing that's happening. And I'll go into a little more detail in a second. I want to spend just a couple seconds talking about the immunity to SARS-CoV-2. It's really unclear. At least 90 companies were allowed emergency approval to come in. They're just starting to clean it up because many of them, the tests are horrible. They're not reproducible. The quality is really very low. They're just cleaning it up. 14 of them were studied at UCSF and Mass General Hospital, and only 3 of them really had reproducibly reliable results, and only 1 had no false positives. But we don't know what the immunity to this disease is. We're learning. With SARS, immunity does occur in patients for approximately 1 year, can be longer. We know that with the regular cold coronaviruses, it's not very good. So we don't know. Now, back to this RADX program. So we are part of the point of care technology research network. Sally McFall and myself, and Matt Glucksberg and Kara Powell-Mountain working in this. We're part of this group. We got funded 2 years ago to develop point of care technologies for HIV/AIDS, focused primarily in sub-Saharan Africa. Also, Mahmoud Omega is involved in this, and it's run out of the site laboratory. So since the whole shutdown and everything, Francis Collins and Bruce Stromberg from NIBIB, and Francis Collins, head of the NIH, of course, said, now everyone, we just have to focus on COVID. So they threw $500 million into the basket. And the goal is to scale up this diagnostic capacity by November of this year, if not sooner, in order to get people to go back to work. So when people are going back to work or back to school, you're going to have to be testing lots of asymptomatic people. And that's really the goal. So it's got to be something quick. It's got to be something that, is at least in some kind of progress. And it's on a really, really fast track. You probably heard of this. You might have gotten an email from me the other day to help with this. But it goes in, it's a kind of a very unusual and very fast timeline. So phase 0, you submit your application. It's all done online. This is a guaranteed review within 2 weeks, where there's this deep dive Shark Tank thing, where then you're kind of like, you go online with these people, and they're going to ask you very specific questions about everything about your project. You get $25,000 just for sitting through that. And they'll tell you whether you're going to go to phase 1. And some people might be pretty far advanced. They could go directly to phase 2. But let's assume they send you to phase 1. Phase 1 is if you need like something just to move your project that extra fast step, if money wasn't really of concern. So this is supposed to last only, quote, about a month. It would have to be probably no more than 2 months because the whole timeline is so fast. But this is for an immediate infusion of 500,000 to millions. They won't even say how many millions. they got 500 of them, so it can be many millions. But you have to spend the money really fast, and you have to convince the Shark Tank thing that this is good. So they expect about 20 projects to get to phase 1, and then if you hit the milestones in phase 1, you are eligible to go to phase 2, and phase 2 you're supposed to last 4 months at least to get to the point where you're scaling up, and this is funded at a level of many tens of millions. So they don't even give you a number. So if you can get on that time train, it's a very big grant. There are working groups to support projects for technology, validation, clinical trials, and overall operations to help you overcome hurdles to getting on a timeline like this. And one thing that I'm asking everybody here, if anyone with any expertise in any of this stuff, if you would sign up to be an assessor or a content expert. So if you are, you just go to that website at the top here and you can sign up. I've sent emails out to many of you to see if you can help with this, and thank you for those that said they would help out. So one of the projects that is going to go through is Dave Kelso and Cara Palomon and Sally McFall's M2DX fast PCR, the PCR that's a 15-minute PCR. They already have a prototype really available, and it's CLIA waivable, and so they've got a lot going on already. So they're kind of set up. Julius Lux is considering his submission here, and I heard there was a third one, but I don't know the details about it. But if anyone is interested or needs any more information about this, they can contact Sally or me. So that's a big thing. There's other needs in resources. And one is the serologic testing. There is a protocol, Donna Feinberg, where Mike Eisen is the PI, where they are saving specimens on these patients. And if anyone is interested in those specimens, they need for validation of something they're working on. Mike Eisen from the transplant unit in infectious disease is the PI of that. Anything with PPE, swabs, reagents, capacity increase, of course, there's actually lots of funding out there for that. And then we do have this Institute of Global Health Catalyzer Awards. We've had a couple applications from BME already, actually 2 that got funded. And these are approximately 25,000. It can be more, but that's the average. It's got to be a 1-year project. There's rolling applications right now, and funding decisions are guaranteed within 1 week. And Mahmoud Umega got 2 of those last week. All the projects have to be COVID-19 related. Projects with the Institute for Global Health, you have to have an international component. If you don't have one and you want one, we can help you with that. You also, as a faculty member, you have to be a member of the Institute, but being a member of the Institute is 1 click away, and basically you just sign up. So it's easy. So what does it take to get through all this? It takes science and it takes leadership. I think the science is going pretty good. We've got NIH, NSF, CDC, DOD now focusing a lot on COVID-19. The vaccine development is rigorous. The therapeutics is rigorous. Developing new drugs, refocusing old ones. A lot of them have already hit the wayside. Our problem is the leadership, and that this thing is being led by this task force that has very little expertise on it. You have Anthony Fauci, who's director of NIAID, I think is probably one of the leading public health and infectious disease experts in the world. He's doing a fantastic job, all things considered. But everybody else on there, as a team, it's pretty weak. But anyway, this is just the life we have. So my concluding slide. So the best way forward, everything is doable. We have to continue with the social distancing. As you all know, there's a lot of political stuff going on right now about, I want to be free, I don't want to do social distancing. It's really, we are all in this together, and the social distancing is what has brought down that bump in the curve and has kept our hospitals functional during this time. It will go away, but the social distancing is a big part of it, and it's here at least for another month. And then after that, it's we're going to be let out into our old activities on a step-by-step basis. The schools and universities basically are closed till fall. Let's assume everything will be okay by then, or at least we can get to some kind of level of functioning. People who are unemployed now that don't have a lot of funds to sit through this, I mean, that's a huge thing. And also with their health insurance, the unemployment rates are through the roof. We have to continue with this testing ramp up. Illinois is finally there with 19,000 people checked just yesterday. That's definitely going in the right direction. And actually, countrywide is supposed to be testing 500,000 people per day. That's what Harvard School of Public Health predicts. We've got to continue with this ramp up of things. The Defense Production Act should be invoked in the right places. And we need to support and enforce the public health policy vigilantly. The group here, the Illinois Department of Public Health and the City of Chicago Department of Public Health and the Cook County Department of Public Health, there's all three. We have all three here. Are working actually very closely with the University of Chicago and Northwestern epidemiologists and those at Argonne. And actually they have a really good model. It's better than the other ones. They're getting more information put into, I think it's a better model. And continue with these vaccine initiatives and antiviral drug development programs. And ideally restore after this is over anyway, restore the pandemic response team, which was dismantled a couple of years ago. And in addition to restoring the pandemic response team, it really should be internationalized. So we collaborate with our international partners. There's no reason why we can't work together on this. The virus is certainly international. And the final comment really is more forceful we act now, the shorter the problem is going to be in the end until the disease burns out, we get a vaccine or we get some therapy. And those are all happening kind of as we speak. So I want to thank the following people giving me the slides and some of the ideas. These are the famous Tony Fauci donuts from New York. And I thank you very much. And I can take some questions.